If you didn't understand before, I hope you understand now. Because you're now listening to the We Talking podcast brought to you by Island Girl Team. This podcast, we are literally talking about every and anything with your girl, Kamilah Gumbs. So subscribe from wherever you get your podcast and get ready to talk. Welcome to episode 7 of the We Talking podcast. And today's guest, we have Aisha Smoorenburg. And today we're going to talk about climate resilience and disaster management in Sint Maarten. So just a little quick facts about Aisha. She was born in the Netherlands, but grew up in Sint Maarten from age 7 onwards. And she did a lot of volunteering in high school, which made helping people something that she wanted to do in her daily life. So she pursued her bachelor's program in global project and change management, because she had such passion around the topics of climate change and sustainability, especially since there's not much awareness about it, especially in Sint Maarten. So we're going to have that conversation today, and thank you for being here.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's honestly a pleasure, and I'm super excited.
I feel like this is going to be really good, and so we could just jump into the meat of the matter. So my first question for you is, what motivated you to actually do your final research on the status of our climate resilience in Sint Maarten?
Well, basically it really started because I had to do a final assignment for my bachelor's program, my thesis. And I knew that in general, actually, before I left the island, I wanted to come back. That's always been a motivation. It was also the motivation for choosing the study program that I did. And I knew I wanted to work with climate resilience. And so I had going back and climate resilience or climate change more so.
Mm-hmm.
And while I was looking for internships, because it was also in the middle of the pandemic, it was very hard to get through. And initially I actually applied for an internship in the States, but because of COVID and backlog with a visa, that didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
And so my other option in that case was Sint Maarten. And I don't know, maybe the universe was like, nope, you're not going to the States because it's necessary over there. But everything really works out wonderfully. And that's how I actually got to do my internship location, which was the disaster management organization of Sint Maarten. And I actually had complete freedom when it came to my topic. There were no severe guidelines besides technical criteria. And so it was just an opportunity for me to spearhead the conversation of climate change within this department. And so it was the motivation of wanting to do something, because when I look at motivation as well, you asked about motivation. I don't think that there is a more urgent issue than climate change that affects us globally. I know that's a very harsh phrase because there's a lot of issues that we are facing.
Yeah, there's a lot, but
it's a little too much. But this is just what I find important, because it's greater than political discussions. It's something that is almost, if not already, out of our control.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, literally looking at the context, people are talking about the most aggressive things, even potentially war. You can't have a war if your planet is dying either. People the planet, which we're already doing, or the planet will do that, itself.
Yep.
And so in order to at least have a world, I don't condone violence, but if you want to be violent, let's at least have a world where we can be violent. Because,
at least let us, have a possibility to breathe while, you want to enact in these violence. Yeah.
Live a basic life. And I think that it's honestly also such a relevant conversation, the topic of climate change.
Mm-hmm.
I think for our generation, when we look at it, because we're feeling the full effect of what is happening and we're running out of time. And time, I think throughout my thesis as well, was a really central point, because that's the one resource that we don't have anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So that all really kind of funneled down into the motivation of pursuing climate resilience. I started with climate change. I wanted to do it basically more about what is the status of awareness on climate change. My college thought that wasn't super interesting because that's just a bit monotonous. So back and forth, we got, along with some help of my colleague and my counselors, I managed to make it more specific and look at a systemic approach of building climate resilience.
Mm-hmm.
Because climate resilience is often interpreted as a very vague and broad topic. If you really try to
Yeah.
define it, even in literature, one says this, the other says something else. So it really,
Mm-hmm.
so I think defining it was important, but also looking at how do you build it or who builds it.
Yeah. That makes sense. That makes really much sense. And I guess that really goes into like our second question is, you did all this research, you spent all this time back home, you had all these different conversations. I know we were talking about, you're like, yeah, I have this interview today, I have that interview today. But, what are like some striking positives, which I know in the context of Sint Maarten can be kind of hard to find, but what also some of the striking positives and negatives that you've discovered about how we do our disaster management and how we view climate resilience? And I think, having those ideas is very striking, especially since we're still rebuilding from Hurricane Irma and Maria. So, yeah.
Yes, no, honestly, like when I saw the question list, this is kind of the one that I was most excited about because this is basically my thesis when it comes down to
Mm-hmm.
it, because I looked at, in very short, I basically looked at the three components of any community, any kind of organization, which consists of the system. You have the agents that work in the system, and you have institutions, which basically refers to the way that the system and the agents interact. So in the context of disaster management, the disaster management organization is the system. That is
Mm-hmm.
where what is surrounded as. The agents are the members, and the institutions are the protocols that they execute in times of disaster within that phase of preparation, mitigation, response, and recovery. So
Mm-hmm.
those were the elements in my research, and I interviewed members of the organization to see where the vulnerabilities lie.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I got the positive and the negatives from. A lot came from just the conversations because my thesis, of course, focused more academically on the statistics and the facts.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I'd love to start with the positives because that's points.
How was
Um,
a good how was a good point
I
with the
was,
positives?
I mean, I think you'll understand when I say this. I was happy that I found positives. That was actually very uplifting because for certain things, you always kind of have a view on St. Maarten. I think to a certain extent, you kind of get biased, especially when you move out. If you understand what I mean, like, because you see just
Mm-hmm.
how different things function. It's not necessarily better or worse, but it's just different. And looking at the organization itself, I didn't think that they would be this aware about how serious climate change is. So when I
Mm-hmm.
engaged in the conversations, there was such an agreement, but also examples of how they're taking this topic seriously, how they're trying to make efforts bit by bit to not only fight climate change, but build resilience. I think resilience has been a word or a concept that has been used in St. Maarten as well for campaigns. They love the word
Oh, the word resilient
resilience.
is.
But resilience is also hard to define. And I feel like we never
Mm-hmm.
really got past or fully through a definition phase of what does it mean to be resilient. And so having a closer scope of, okay, you're resilient against climate change. There was a conversation being held. It's already a topic that is a part of many discussions that are being held. It's being incorporated as an objective or a goal in projects, from what I understand as well. So that was a really positive no, because I honestly thought that climate change was maybe even considered a bit taboo, um,
Mm-hmm.
because you sometimes don't know that you're experiencing the consequences. Because on St. Maarten,
Yep.
it would rain drastically and everyone would be like, oh my God, yeah, these like Caribbean or these tropical rain storms that just they're done in 2 minutes and we're good. These severe weather conditions are a consequence of climate change. And,
Yep.
the extreme heat, the droughts that you see on the hills on the French side, um,
bad.
the contributions that global warming is an actual thing. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, science has not directly confirmed, or in that sense specifically identified a direct link between, for example, global warming and severely intensified hurricanes. But
Mm-hmm.
patterns do show a trend. I
Yeah.
mean, if you look at hurricanes between, I think during my research, I also looked up like what were the trends. Between 1852 up to now, Irma was the only hurricane category 5 plus. Not only 5 plus, category 5, because apparently even Lewis was still considered a category 4.
Yeah.
So it's just the evidence to a certain extent is there, but it still needs to be taken seriously. But because
Mm-hmm.
there is no research on it, there is a hesitation that I saw, which does, in a sense, bring me to a negative, because a lot of times they ask me for specific examples of, okay, well then how does climate change, influence this or that directly? And I don't have all the answers. And I
Mm-hmm.
noticed that that was a part of the mentality there, that they need evidence, which I completely understand, but that does not mean that you don't pursue it at
Yeah.
all.
And I mean, like, if we're being honest, like if they're like, I need evidence, you just look at how our coastline shall change. Like just look at our coastline. Stand up outside. This was not the same sun you were standing up in 20 years ago. Like you can feel
Exactly.
the difference in the heat. And so it's like,
It's so noticeable when you really start paying attention.
mm-hmm,
Um, but that's just something that is not yet, I think, like there is awareness, but it is to a certain extent. Because if you look at, for example, the more governmental part of
mm-hmm,
Ireland, the public sector, there is an awareness and there is an incorporation, because
mm-hmm.
I was able to analyze this personally. I don't know what the status is when it comes to the community. And I don't think that resilience or climate resilience is something that you can build only as an organization, because you need to do it as a country.
Yeah.
It the top down approach. You also need to have that lobbying and demand for change from a bottom up approach. I think
Mm-hmm.
the way St. Maarten functions, you need both, because one or the other is just not going to work by itself.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of positives, though, there is a willingness. Like a lot of them also mention specifically that there is a willingness. We want to adapt. We just don't know how. We would love to do this. We just don't have the resources. So there's
Mm-hmm.
always a comma, but. And I think that directly brings me to one of the biggest negatives that I find personally. I mean, I academically drew conclusions on it as well, but I feel like St. Maarten has become comfortable with saying we don't have the money, or we don't have,
Yeah.
or we don't have the time or the capacity. And
Mm-hmm.
that's become more of a comfortable excuse rather than a justified reason to put things on like a standstill, or for things to take so long. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know the details, of course. I mean, I'm not in that organization personally, but I know
Mm-hmm.
that you can get creative. I know
Yeah.
that and you don't need to invent the wheel twice either. I mean, look at your neighboring islands. There's such a richness of a community there with knowledge and expertise and resources that are accessible if you
Mm-hmm.
make use of it. And it's just every positive, I would say, was still to a certain extent. There was awareness to a certain extent. There was
Mm-hmm.
willingness to a certain extent, because it shouldn't require too much effort. It should be easy. It should be free. And if you continuously condition the criteria for you to make impactful changes that are necessary for you to be sustainable, if you're looking at future generations, you can't be picky.
Yep.
You can't afford to be picky.
Mm-hmm.
And oh, yeah, one of my favorite metaphors that I use to explain the importance to people that I interviewed was that I noticed on St. Maarten, and I know you're going to agree with this, but we love incremental adaptation. We
Oh
adapt
yeah.
in little
Mm-hmm.
bits. The prime metaphor that I use is our beloved potholes. There are so many potholes on the island, and
So
every
many.
we put a little bit of dirt and a little bit of cement just for a quick fix to fix the road. and make the road less inconvenient for its users, right? But then not even a month later, the hole is back.
Yep.
So why not invest more to just fix it on a long term?
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think, is a mentality that we no longer can afford. I don't know why we
Yeah.
can't afford it in the first place.
Honestly. I will say to that though, I guess someone took your suggestion, told the minister, because apparently Romy is working on new asphalt technology to make sure we don't have to patch roads that often, which I'm like, okay, I see you.
Maybe Birdie heard me.
Maybe
Or maybe
somebody
I
heard
wasn't
you.
the only one. I doubt I was the only one.
I doubt you were the only one. But the message finally was heard. So we're getting
so that kind of change. We need to become transformative because again, we don't have the resources. But it's not just St. Maarten doesn't have the resources. The world is running out of resources. This is a global thing that is happening. And so you need to do with what you have. And I don't feel like the resources are always being allocated efficiently because there is no centralized vision of where you want to go, not only as perhaps an organization, but as an island, like as a community, as a whole. What is our vision for the next year? Where do we want to be in the next 5 years? And I'm a firm believer that becoming climate resilient should be embedded in the foundation of that decision-making process, because it's not like that. It's so much work that you need to have separate teams working on this, but you can incorporate it in the things that you do. You can incorporate, because I developed like a small, tiny sort of decision-making framework that if you want the outcome of your efforts to reflect climate resilience, you need to incorporate knowledge about it, okay, which is accessible for free. Like if I could have found it, anyone can find it. The knowledge is there. Tap into it. You need to have a shared mission and vision as an organization because that will filter your system. And if climate resilience is in that filtration, it will be embedded. And you need to have an involvement of all the stakeholders. You cannot leave people in the dark because it's going to require an immense amount of teamwork and the setting aside of egos. If your goal is to make St. Maarten the euphoria that it can be.
That is very true. And that has me thinking, because I know you mentioned everyone's like, we don't have enough manpower, but then it's like, because we always talk about we have a capacity issue, right? That's always been the thing. And so when we think about it, if we're always having willingness or ideas and things to a certain extent, do we really have a capacity issue, or are we just piling so many things on other people that certain positions don't actually do their job to the standard that needs to be there, and then you have an issue because nothing is getting done because the people who are doing it are doing everything under the sun, and the people who aren't doing anything are doing anything. So it is like, how do we manage our human resources in this case? Because it's like, we're limited. Yeah, we're 16 square miles. Okay, cool. But I feel like even when we view things in a business standpoint, just because we're a capitalistic society, why don't we organize the way we function in certain ways to make sure we're able to capitalize on how much we can with the limited manpower we have? I don't know. That was just a thought that came up in my head, because I was just like,
bring up an extremely good point that I had not even considered, because it links to what I said earlier as well. Like, it kind of sounds like an excuse, like, oh, we don't have the budget, so the conversation is done.
Yeah.
But why don't we make the budget? Like, you know what your budget is, so why don't you allocate a certain amount of the budget that you have that is indeed limited, because it's better to have something than nothing.
Yeah.
And what shocked me was that certain interviews resulted in people saying, but what does this really have to do with us? And that's what I mean is with like awareness to a certain extent. Like, I don't think that people understand the full impact. Take Irma, for example, like a very brief example. Irma was strengthened, and it was influenced by climate change. The severity and frequency of hurricanes and natural disasters is drastically increased due to climate change. This is scientifically proven. Hurricane Irma, we're still recovering from it 4 years later. Tourism.
You don't have an airport.
You don't have an airport. We thrive on tourism. What do you mean it doesn't have to do with us? You know, like, or just that being a question in itself, I find was really interesting. And it was from various interviews that I've done that it was just like, and I'm happy at the end of the day. I'm very happy that I was able to put into perspective, like it does have an effect, because anything that you do within this organization directly affects the lives or livelihoods of citizens of St. Maarten. Because the frequency and severity is increasing, God forbid, a week after Irma, we had Irma 2.0.
We got lucky with Maria. We really got lucky because like, imagine, because I remember like sitting on in the car listening to Listen 101. Shout out to them. They're the only radio station that be working after hurricane. You know? And then they're like, oh yeah, there's the next projections of another storm. The original projections had Maria going right over us.
Exactly.
We still got the really bad winds and everything from it, but Maria was supposed to hit the same trajectory Irma was supposed to give. And we got lucky that it decided to go a little north. Unfortunately, it went straight for Puerto Rico, but it was like, if the wind shifted another way,
it was a little bit different, it would have been a completely different outcome.
Who knows what any of us would have been in that situation? Because so, like, I guess I got a little emotional because I was there for Irma, but like it was like, you know, it's like just to see so much roofs and everything. I don't think my house would have stand if Maria came. Because exactly. I looked up. There was a moment where the second biggest tree in our house, I think, the Guinea tree, literally lifted itself up and put itself between the back of a house and the wall we have, so it would like lodge in between there, and it was like right in front of my parents' like bedroom. And we look out the window and we were like, how in the world we can get this tree from the back here? Okay, a big old tree, and I'm like, how we can get this tree out of here? You know, the wind pick up that tree and pull it from out of that large space.
What?
Out of it.
Oh my god.
So people be like, yeah, you know, we get hurricanes all the time, blah blah blah. I was like, this hurricane was picking up 100-year-old trees. Like it shouldn't.
You hear this that they saw catamarans, 40-foot containers just being swept up into the air like it was absolutely nothing.
Like it was like a piece of cloth. And so it's like, it's always, I guess, I wouldn't say amusing, but it's fascinating to me when people are like, they will tell you what they see in Irma, and they're like, yeah, this was like one of the craziest things we've seen. We haven't seen anything like this since Lewis. And then you're like, okay, but you know, we have to change how we build, our planning and stuff, because it's gonna continue to get worse. And they're like, I don't really see the problem. And I'm just here like, what do you mean you don't really see the I was like, hey guys, like, and a lot of this really spans from, I think, one of the most interesting things that I've learned recently is that, so my dad, he's a child of the 60s, the 70s. So he witnessed all the development of the country. Aisha, when I tell you parts of the island that is filled in, that I didn't even know was actually filled in. I was like, wait, what? He was like, no. Like, he's like, the lagoon used to go all the way. Like, the places he would say the lagoon used to reach so far back. What? The Great Salt Pond was his backyard, basically. Because, you know, like Front Street, Back Street, like all of that was like, after Back Street, it was just pond. And like, of course, like I knew Pondfield was Pondfield because they were like Pondfield. Like, you know, it was just like, yeah. But then when the people start telling me how much of like the lagoon was filled in, and I was just like, I think the most striking thing that I know, the lagoon used to go all the way into Margaret.
What?
Okay, I will pull up the after this. I'll pull up the map.
No
I
way.
think I give everyone the chance to pull up the map. Find somebody that you know from Sint Maarten that grew up or understand the geography of the island or grew up within the 60s and 70s and let them describe to you how much body of water was in this country that we just filled in for development but never thought about the environmental catastrophe that could have possibly happened because we filled it. And so when people but we the flood so quick, half of the country is on water.
I am so shocked right now.
And so it's so crazy. So it's so when people are and it's telling because a lot of the people that you're telling me are yeah, we know this, but what does this really have to do? And you had these opportunities to educate. A lot of these people grew up seeing these developments. Right. And so it had me thinking of I guess this will go into my in your question in regards of education. Of course, then I tend to make a joke yeah, I tell my dad all the time, yeah, you had a colonial education, of course. But back then you were so focused on learning on what's happening outside of Ireland, you wasn't really paying attention to what's happening inside.
Yeah.
And so, and of course, nobody was really about certain scientists talking about the changing of climate and stuff in those decades. How do we make this educational effort? And I know when people say educational effort, they just automatically think we go into the schools, but this is more than just going into the schools.
Yeah, definitely.
What do you see that we can make a great educational campaign for the island, but not in a way that it seemed, I guess, how to put it, in a way that is consumable? Because we know that, a lot of people would have these conversations with changing, environmental stuff and can seen as very pretentious, especially since unfortunately a lot of time people who have these conversations come from a place of privilege. But how do we present that information in a way that is consumable to the common everyday person living on the island and that they're willing to, I guess, make a change from it? How do you see that?
I think that's a very good question. No, I don't know, while you're asking me that, I just a small idea popped in my head, but I think you need to make it understandable on the micro level, because I said, resilience, for example, is always such a big concept. Climate change is such a broad concept that means so many things, but it means a lot of different things for different people. You can't go to Sint Maarten people and be the ice caps are melting, we need to worry about the Alaskans, because they're being okay, that's good.
Yeah.
You really bring it down to its roots of what it could mean for Sint Maarten. I think one prime example is in a careful manner, because your goal is also you don't want to install fear. You just want people to be prepared. Your main goal, I think, should be to prepare them on an educational level. That's definitely what it starts with. But just explaining down to the roots, why it should be done. Looking at, for example, hurricane preparation, I think that even with Irma, things escalated a lot as well in the last few days before it hit. But people were preparing 2 days beforehand. I think that it should be a norm instead of only playing on the radio. Don't forget, it's hurricane season. Don't wait till it's too late. Be storm ready at all times. I think it's a great
look. The way Cedric Peterson has make a living making those notices. It's crazy.
Don't get me wrong. It's not useless. It's beyond critical to constantly remind people. But you need to be careful, because at one point people get fed up. When you see the same ad on YouTube, you're constantly why am I not seeing something else? But the only way that you can emphasize it is explain what it means for them. What does it mean for you, Kamilah Gumbs, living on St. Maarten if you are not prepared to this extent for not necessarily even a worst case scenario. But, and I feel like that looks a little bit also at the next question that you have, but that's where it jumps into the systemic approach of organizations that carry that responsibility to not only communicate that, but understand it, because there is a giant lack of knowledge on the island. There is an immense lack of research that would carry the proof that people need. Because even if you look at a similar context, for example, small developing island states, which is a common group that St. Maarten is a part of that have similar characteristics, it's still not St. Maarten. There are still barriers that St. Maarten might only have to deal with or deal with differently because of the way that the culture works, the government is set up, the people that are in the places, you know. So you can only copy to such an extent. But I think that the first responsibility lies with them, because you cannot expect a citizen to just wake up one day and say, you know what? Why are hurricanes getting so bad? Let me Google that. Climate change? Yeah. Wow, that's crazy. You know, like you can't expect that. You need to drive that. You need to make it important. Make it important. Make it a priority. But unless that is done internally, how would it ever be expressed to your community so that they can be prepared?
It's true. And then it's like, it goes up to like, I guess we already went to the last follow-up question, but it really goes into of how do you, and I guess in a sense, no one will have the answer except the people in those positions, but how do you change the narrative within these governmental structures that everything isn't just about tourism and concrete? Like,
yeah, I have a prime answer to that. I've been a firm believer of this, and I think that my experience of the internship that I did in the past 4 years strengthened it. And I kind of mentioned it earlier, but we need to have a bottom-up approach as well. We need to start lobbying. We need to start demanding it, because it's not going to come naturally. Interests might not always be aligned, people, and not necessarily interests, but priorities. I mean, like I said in the beginning, you know, I find climate change most important, and other people would be like, okay, like we know that the environment is not doing so well, but politics or you know, like technological advancements. But this is just something that will affect any other conversation that you have.
Yeah.
As a small island, I mean, luckily we're not on a list of islands that is expected to be underwater in the next 10 years, but there's definitely rising sea levels. We need to understand our island. We need to not only understand its people, we need to understand its geography. We need to understand how, you know, what parts would be submerged if the island, if the sea, the rising sea levels affects it.
We wouldn't have a capital.
Exactly, you know, but like also where do you turn to, because we don't have space? Does everyone just go and live in a teepee hut in the hills? You know, but these are conversations that you need to have right now. And a lot of times, you know, the conversation of let's start preparing happens in June before hurricane season. Yep. And this is not something like, you shouldn't wait for that season to come to make sure that your preparations are in order, that you start looping that be prepared at all times more frequently on the radio. Why not have, for example, like, you know, when you're in the movies and you go to see a movie and you have all those little trailers, why not make a short cartoon thing about, hey, did you know about climate change? A little 30-second information, something. Like, there's such little efforts that I think like no small effort is wasted in this sense, because we're at the starting lines, I think, on St. Maarten when it comes to the battle of climate change. Yeah. And it's no longer a choice. And once we systemically start understanding that, and like I said, you know, it's just, it has to become a part of your thought process. It has to become a part of your decision making. You don't have to say like, okay, is this going to be climate resilient or not? But just weigh out the benefits. Look at what you're doing on a higher level. Like, I remember when I was there during one of the press briefings, I heard the question like, when are we finally going to eliminate plastic bags? How is that still a conversation? You know, like that's something that, And I mean, you can't fully compare that to like certain countries, but it's just like that should have already been established, and it's a small effort. But if our decision-making process on switching over from plastic to paper bags is already taking so long, that's not very reassuring, because that's only like a tiny, tiny, tiny little effort that technically does not have that big of an influence, because like plastic bags must definitely pollute and everything, but
Yeah.
how much does that pollute to the bigger picture?
Yeah. And if we can't make the small changes, what gives us the confidence to believe we can make the big changes?
Exactly.
It's crazy. And it's always, like you said, people are like, oh, but this, but that. We're not gonna have technology. We're not going to have this if we're not there.
like
I think
not to only think worst case scenario, but one tsunami and that's it. Like that's it. There's no that's it. And
they expect all of us to be on peak party. Like it's not gonna work.
We have kayaks like installed that we're ready to hop on and just like paddle to Puerto Rico. You know, like we're not gonna be okay. Even if a new hurricane comes, I don't think that we will be okay. Like
we're not, because there's still a lot of, I guess, debris in a sense. There's a lot of places that are not rebuilt. Okay, of course, striking example is the airport. I have this weird thing. You can't, only me could talk bad about Sint Maarten. Like if you're not from Sint Maarten, you can't talk bad about us.
I feel that.
So when I went home for vacation, and you know when you come off the plane, you gotta go on the little bus so they could carry you across to go through immigration. Yeah. And this lady was like, why we can't just walk? I'm looking around. I'm like, ma'am, this is an active construction site. I'm like, it's actually quicker, because we were waiting for everyone to get on the bus. She's like, I feel like if we walked, we would have been there already. And I'm like, okay, you walk faster than most. All right, that's great. And I was like, it's also quicker to just go in the bus. It's a quick turnaround.
Yeah.
Every sign you come in says, this is a construction site. I'm just like, if something fall and hit on you, you'll be the first person to sue the country. We don't have money. We're always in court anyways. We don't need any court cases. And like, because the bus ride was quick, because you just really bust in the corner.
Yeah.
And she's like, I feel like this is a waste of time. We could have just walked. And I was like, yeah.
I'm not gonna
It is.
Like I have, but that was only because we literally like we were all the way on the right already.
Oh, so, okay. That part they usually make you walk.
That's what I thought. But then they were literally like, get on the bus. And I kid you not, Cam. Like we got on the bus, it took off, and like a second later it stopped.
No, we were on the other side of the airport. Like, oh no, that one they usually make you walk, but
I could have walked. Like this could have been an email. Like
yeah, it could have been an email. So like, and then of course I'm like, in my head, of course, I was defensive. I was like, ma'am, you're the one here for vacation, so I don't know why you out here making all these complaints. But then I sat home and I was like, oof, we need to hurry up build this airport, because all of this is very inefficient and this is not really helping.
Exactly. Like,
and all the
country, when you hear them like tourists in the airport, like, this looks a bit like it's embarrassing.
and you just gotta be up there defending for your life. It was like I'm like, man, we're going through tough times. We're going through tough times. And then it's like, I'm going home. I'm like, okay, can you guys, hey, hi, can we speed this up a little bit? Exactly. It's been 4 years. 4?
Going on 5. This year is going to be 5 years.
This year's going to be 5. So I'm just like, maybe we need to get ourselves together.
On one side, like I said, it's embarrassing. On the other hand, when a hurricane comes, it's a health hazard. It can endanger hundreds of thousands of people. So, and I don't know. I mean, I don't doubt that is something that is being taken seriously. I'm just not seeing it. And I'm at a point where growing up to Sint Maarten, you get tired of just hearing, yeah, we're going to do this. We're going. We promise. And you're just so desperate to see a change. And And that's just like, I mean, it was like there were a lot of positives, a few positives, but of my research, but that's just where we are right now.
Mm-hmm.
And on one side, it was hopeful. On the other hand, it's like, ooh, a lot needs to be done for us to be able to do this. And climate resilience is not an absolute state. It's not like one day you wake up and it's like, oh, we're climate resilience. It's a constant effort that you need to act out. And it starts with those who are responsible, but you need to have an enabled organization that carries out those responsibilities, because if members within your organization are still not clear about some things, it becomes a priority to make sure that your members and your staff are enabled with what they need in order to be able to do their jobs the way that you expect them to, or the way that is required right now, because climate change is not going anywhere. Very much here, but we're just not progressing. And because it was one of the things, for example, that came up a lot is that it's a lot of workload. And it is, because there's a lot that needs to be done. But the thing is, and that was also one of the questions actually of my school, why did I look at vulnerabilities? Because that automatically has a negative connotation. Like you're vulnerable, you're weak, you're exposed.
But we are.
But we are, exactly. Like, because they asked me, like, why didn't you look at the capabilities? And my response to that was, we can't afford to. We don't have the resources to just try and fix things and see if they work out. We're running on E. So our decision-making process needs to be so filtered and critically analyzed so that we don't waste the resources that we already don't have.
Yeah.
Because otherwise we're just going to be in that same loop of doing things and then looking back and wondering why it didn't work out. And I think that's the definition of crazy.
Yeah, definitely is.
Anything.
Yeah. And I think one of the craziest things too, and I've noticed that as, we're slowly becoming in that age. It's weird, we're getting old, but we're slowly becoming that age when people are looking at us and like, yeah, you're the young professional that is ready to come back home and fix this. But I think one of the ails is that people don't realize that some people could be like me and you, and we're just like, we could come back in and we're like, I'll fix it. I'll do it.
Let's go.
You're paying me $10. I'll do it. Sure, whatever. We'll do it
for free.
But then you have a lot of, young professionals who are like, sure, I'll help, but I'm not coming back without a structured system.
Yeah.
And because I make this joke, culturally we're relaxed people, which is good because, we don't need to be stressed all the time. But because we've spent decades upon decades implementing that we're relaxed people within our governmental system, we're running not a relaxed country, but an incompetent country to the point that it's like we're not capable of actually doing things. And I believe that, systems, I should not be the one that be like, oh, I'm coming in to fix the system. I'm 22 years old. I should not be here thinking about fixing systems.
Exactly.
I should be thinking about my Blackboard discussion board, which I just remember I need to do today. But like, it's just like, I should not,
exactly.
Yes, we're having these conversations because that's our interest. That is what we're studying. But if someone who's studying in, let me think, art history, I don't know, something random. Somebody's thinking art history shouldn't be sitting down and like, I need to change the systems back home so I can go home and share my art. No, they should just be able to like, oh, I have these systems in place. I can come back home and contribute with my art. And so I think, I don't know if this is like, oh my gosh, a wake up call. I don't know how much times you could wake up people, but it's like, of course, if the time comes and it's like, we have to fix it. But my hope is our time doesn't have to come to do it.
Yeah.
Like, my hope is, we're currently in a situation. This is, despite all of the confusion, this is our most stable government since 2010. This is a weird sentence to say.
But that gives me hope. In a sense.
Yeah, it gives hope on like maybe we're going into the right direction. Maybe we haven't taken the strides. Maybe we just took a little step, like just on one step into the room. But it's like I just want more effort into changing these systems, and while we fix and make these structured systems, we'd be able to achieve things like this. We'd be able to understand the issues of climate change, because honestly, if we're at this point in our stage where we're like, I'm not really understanding climate change, that means I feel like you calling me crazy, because I live in the great old US. We know how they feel about certain things. Literally, snow 2 days ago. I checked the weather. It's supposed to be 70 degrees on Monday. For the Celsius people, that's about 19, 18 degrees, coming from negative 18-ish degrees. And so it's like, of course, we're in the tropical region, so the changes aren't that drastic. But I had saw people complaining about how it was cold. And, of course, for me, like, you up here, you're like, y'all not really cold. But then when you put it in like perspective, it's like, oh, wait, nah, this is kind of cold for the region. This is actually pretty kind of cold.
Exactly.
What are we doing to prepare for that? How does that reflect in our infrastructure? Like I said, we love to pour concrete, but are we pouring our concrete?
Is concrete the best option? For example, and that's one thing as well that I really try to emphasize, is that we normalize on St. Maarten that climate change is more than bigger hurricanes, because there's such a focus, which I understand because it's the most frequent, most common kind of natural disaster that St. Maarten experiences. But put it into perspective, we're dependent on import. With extreme weather changes, agriculture is drastically affected. Prices will go up.
Prices are going up.
I mean, they're continuously going up. Like products might not be available anymore. That's one kind of thing. St. Maarten being a touristic destination because of its heat, and the world is heating up. Some people don't need to leave their house anymore, and they don't need to go that far for vacation. Like, there's so many. It's such a complex issue because it's interconnected in our entire system, and not only socioeconomically, but ecologically. Like, it covers all the three elements that I think allow us to be human beings, and that's why I think it stands so central. But I need us to move on from a point of awareness. I need it to transition to action. And it's also, it doesn't have to be this drastic change of all of a sudden we're building sea dikes and we're hiring all those people that build the sea dikes in the north of the Netherlands and saying, you know what, just build us like a wall around the island. We're going to be fine.
You see, the thing is, I feel like that's going to be like the thing solution, because all we like to do is build. We have no. Can you tell I'm very anti-Ministry of Romy right now? Because all we literally do is build, because it's like,
and on top of that, like, we need to understand the consequences of, for example, when a building permit gets violated, because they're there for a reason. Like, with increased earthquakes, like I remember I was in St. Maarten when that earthquake, I think it was like a 4-point-something earthquake hit, and I was like, whoa, what is happening? Like, this is new. This is not happening a bit. And apparently there were tremors the whole time as well. And I'm like, this again is influenced by climate change. So we need to take it seriously. it's so much more than just droughts or weather conditions. And I think that's just what's not fully clicked yet, or like maybe the extent of it is not clicked. But I also think, because at the end of the day, St. Maarten, as a tiny, teeny island, is maybe 0.0000000 something percent responsible for carbon dioxide.
The global, yeah.
No, as compared to America, Russia, China, whatever, right? Doesn't mean we don't feel 100,000% of the consequences. So as much as we should be pointing fingers and lobbying, like with these bigger companies and everything, to stop, I think as a Caribbean, not only as an island, but as a Caribbean, because sometimes I just feel like people forget the Caribbean exists, and it's just this paradise of a few islands that people can call their vacation home for 2 weeks once a year.
Yep.
Like, this is a home to millions of people. And all these bigger countries, I don't know, like they carry the biggest role, but that does not, again, mean that we should also not start internally, because we also carry our responsibility. Unfortunately, someone else's mess that we're often cleaning up. But you can't decide and point fingers and be like, no, they got to fix it.
Yeah, because they can't, if we're like, okay, they fix it, and they're like, yeah, one, they don't care, but let's say in a hypothetical situation, they're like, oh, we're caring, and then they come look, I'm like, but why are you pointing fingers if your house is also like this? We have, I don't know if there are pictures. I wish if this was something I would have thought of at the age of 3 in 2004 to take pictures of the progression of the dump. I hope there's someone who has taken pictures, because my family, one of my cousins, they live in Illegral. You can see right across. I can tell you from a child going up there, I loved standing up on the porch, because you could have seen the entire of town. You could have seen the harbor, everything clear. So especially at night, you know, when town used to be bustling and everything back in those days, especially New Year's was really nice, because if you didn't want to be in the crowd, you would go there to see the fireworks and everything. Cool. I went up there this last year. I go on the porch. I like, can I see a cruise ship? I gotta go peek around this nice new mountain. And then I was like, oh, this is a mountain. I was like, I was like, man, I'm missing something. We got a new hill. I was like, wait. And I was like, oh no, this hill is made of years and years of very composed garbage, which is like, it makes you think of like, okay, it's kind of fascinating how nature works. But then you realize that if something happens on that, that is a lot of toxic like chemicals and everything. And then it's like every year we're like, we're fixing the dump. And I'm like,
again, I'll believe it when I see it. I'm so tired. And like, and that's the same for all the, I call them excuses at this point. I find them excuses, like, we don't have a budget. And of course I don't understand the complexity that goes behind it to the full extent, but still, like, you have a budget. I think
if you see some of the things that are funded in our budget, I feel like,
you understand,
a couple things can be moved around to actually go on some priorities that.
Exactly. And like a prime example, right? Like, because this was one of my recommendations. Because one of the things they kept saying, we don't have the capacity. Everyone is overworked within the organization because they're already dealing with their own things within their respective fields, and then they also have this responsibility of, for example, being in the DMO. But there's no capacity, right? There's also the issue that you mentioned about a brain drain. So how about you kill 2 birds with 1 stone and get interns like myself to come and do researches? You're just not lobbying for it.
Yeah.
There's a gigantic, like, because at the end of the day, like, not everyone is like us that is like, yeah, I want to come back. But you know how many there are though? And we're not making use of that. Because you're not creating opportunities for them to come back. And even if that's not from the jump with the job, I got so much experience from this, not only for myself in that sense and as a professional working in this field, but I was able to make a contribution even though I wasn't even graduated at the time, And that opportunity drives people, I think, like you and me especially, to keep doing something. But it solves your capacity issue. It's an opportunity that you can tap into to get more research from students that are being trained and educated on how to conduct these researches that you can actually use, you know, to help with your decision-making process. Like, that was one of the biggest recommendations that I had. I was just like, increase your capacity with students.
Yeah.
Like, everybody leaves. Give them a reason to come back. You're literally motivating them to come back.
Give people, I think, and a lot of people will come back like, oh, I got to work, do my school, and I get to be on Mullet every Sunday. Why not?
You understand? Like, that's such a, like, in a sense, a quick fix. I mean, I think it's a quick fix because even if it's not necessarily students from Sint Maarten, right, that came from Sint Maarten or were born on Sint Maarten, I remember when I like ended up presenting like my thesis and everything, a lot of my classmates were like, I would love to go to Sint Maarten. If are they busy with any other topics? Like, there is an interest. People love the islands, sometimes for the wrong reasons.
Sometimes for the wrong reasons.
You know, like, that with a grain of salt. But it's there. Why are we not making use of it? And that is the most frustrating to me, is I, as a not yet graduated bachelor student, was able to, within 4 months, develop something, do a research, get data, make decisions. What is stopping them?
Yep. And I feel like utilizing that, you could just create systems and a program and processes that can be stable and everything in between.
With state-of-the-art knowledge, because it's no longer going to be outdated knowledge. I mean, I know there's a lot of people in government that have been there for maybe a little too long, in the sense, like, it's just outdated strategies that they're based on that are no longer relevant with the problems we're dealing with today.
Yeah, and that's the thing. There's a lot of people in those areas that they're like, oh yeah, I got this education 20, 30, 40 years ago, but no one has actually went to learn something new, re-improve, or get recertified or rethink on those educational stuff. Because when you look in other fields, so many other fields, you have to get recertified ever so often. Exactly. Just because knowledge is continuously changing. But then again, at the end of the day, what do we know?
But that is, again, the problem. Because, I mean, we've had such passionate conversations much more often than just this, like, also, the group. So it's just a constant conversation we're having. But then it always ends with, but it is what it is, because it's out of our control. And I find that ridiculous. Because our families are there. That's where we grew up. That is our home. And we just got to accept it.
We just got to accept what's going on. Because it's like, you could yell, scream for so long. But then if they're just not listening, we're just like, hey, who am I?
And to put the mentality of, I think, openness in that sense from the interviews. Before I started my interviews, like I did like a little introduction. I'm doing about climate resilience. I'm looking for they would be like, where are you actually from though? What does that matter? And that's such a common question. And then I'd be like, yeah, like, I was born in the Netherlands, but I grew up here. Oh, from the Netherlands. And I was like, yeah. I know.
We did tell you that was going to be a problem. Especially
you did. You current. I was like, wow, I'm really living this. But it's also, I mean, that's all.
I think that's the thing too. We're in this, I think, because we're also in this very polarizing era of, it needs to be a local, it needs to be this, it needs to be that. I think it's interesting because we don't have a clear definition of what a Sint Maarten is.
Right.
And this going a little bit more culturally specific. We don't have a clear definition of who is a local, who isn't a local, who can contribute, who can take some of our resources that we have, XYZ. How do we feel about immigration, all that jazz. We don't have clear understanding.
Exactly.
Just because we're like, oh, we're so wide open a couple of decades ago, and now we're like, we don't want to be wide open right now. And then you're just like, everything that we're dealing with decolonization, everything. So I was like, that was like, they're gonna see you with your very Dutch name, and they're gonna be like,
who is Aisha Smoorenburg is from anywhere else?
There's like, they would not care that you went to Dominic all your life. And it's like,
They
they would
don't.
just be like, no, you didn't go St. Dominic, you probably went CIA. Like they would just put labels on you. They wouldn't care. And then it's like,
but it's also like, in that sense, I'm sorry, how is that relevant? Because at the end of the day, like, even if I was, I think, born and raised on the island, or if I had never stepped foot on it, it's about the change we're trying to make.
yeah,
We're
you're contributing to the
survive.
change.
We're trying to sustain. We're trying to ensure that hopefully no one would ever have to experience what Irma did to people, you know?
Basically.
So regardless of if I'm from Mars, we should be focusing on the topic of discussion. And I feel like to a certain extent, it was almost like deflecting, you know, like,
and I think
from the main point.
And I really think it's because it always tends back into culturally. And I always say, I'm like, culture is important, but we also need to change and develop how we focus and view things. So because we're such a prideful people, like, we don't need no outside people to come tell us what we need to do. Yes, we do. We do. Because you're not making the efforts to change.
Yeah.
The people that you're sending away that are learning the efforts to change, when they come back, you're like, I don't really want to listen to you because you feel like you're better than us. And then when you have these outside resources, whether they have positive or negative connotations, just because that's how the global politics and stuff works, you're like, no, we have our own here. And then every time you say we have our own here, I'm looking, where we at? None of us are there.
We're our own.
Because none of us want to come back. And it's just like, and you know what it's all boils down to at the end of the day? Who gets to be the person to pour the concrete?
Honestly, the only person that I ever want to see fixing any roads is the pothole man in Phillipsburg. Every time I saw him, like anytime I drove in town and I saw him, like often I'd stop, or Nick would stop to like just give him some money and just be like, we love you, man. Like, because how is it that he's doing a better job?
I don't know. I don't
But
understand.
you see, as well, like in a sense, like that's a kind of lobbying that I would also like to see. Like, I need St. Maarten people to get mad. That sounds like I need them to, in this sense, like not just, for example, accept that climate change is not a topic, but then at the same time, how are we enabling our people to even know that to a certain extent? Like, I just
St. Maarten people getting mad is an interesting thing. I guess we could focus more on this side. We focus a lot more on the dot side. Well, we've been talking mostly about the dot side, but because you know that Frenchman will want something. No, us on the dot side, we're not really into arson. You know, that's not really our thing.
Yeah. Like,
what I do. You're right. I do know that because when I'm again going home over the break had me realize a lot. We listen a lot to public radio. Don't recommend it on a weekly basis, on a daily basis every week. It's a lot. But there are a lot of people who are mad. They just not know how to be mad.
Right.
Or there are a lot of people who are mad about a certain thing, but they lose the plot. They're not really like, they know that it's an issue, but they're not knowing what's the issue, if that makes sense. And so there was a lot of times that people would call into especially to the midday show, cussing. And so, for example, I think a lot of people talk about the roads. Valid, cool. But then there was like a person came in and they started yelling about the number plates. So, you know, we're trying to not get new number plates all the time. You know, trying to do this thing, whatever. And then came in, why do I still gotta pay road tax to the road not even getting fixed? And I was like, wait. I think I know what your issue is here. Let's infrastructure. Your issue here is infrastructure.
Yeah.
Not really the road tax. I don't think that's really your issue. Your issue is the infrastructure. So I don't think we really are good at actually identifying what the issue, what we really want to change.
Mm-hmm.
We just see all of these issues and we're going to just peel all of those issues aggressively on midday radio. And
Yeah.
so trying to figure out, and that's also something I'm curious. I was like, how do we educate people on all the various things that we have, all the various issues that we have, but educated in a non-biased perspective? So, for example, you know, a lot of politicians and stuff, they're like, yeah, we're doing these, you know, live streams and this, that, and this and that. And what they're telling you is what they want you to know.
Yeah.
And so, for example, I can tell you how an answer about climate change will go.
Mm-hmm.
Especially within, you know, people within this current government. They'll be like, yeah, we're paying attention, we're understanding, you know, we have this partnership where we're in Sedima now, etc. Are we gonna find ways to make sure, because you know, tourism is important, and then there's a whole conversation about tourism.
Yeah.
And it's like at the end of the day, a lot of it really boils down to culture.
Yeah.
But we're also a stubborn people. So.
And I think as well, what definitely should not be overlooked is that St. Maarten people already have a lot on their plate, you know? And so it's a lot to process as well. Like, I mean, at the end of the day, whether you're a scientist with a PhD or you're not at all, you know, it's still a lot to process and understand because there's still so many question marks. But imagine having to take that on as well. Like we experience it ourselves. Like we just had this conversation before we officially start. Like it's a lot going on that you have all at once.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to somehow prioritize it and you can't forget one or the other. So finding that balance and being able to educate also without planting that seed of fear, because the last thing you want is people to be scared. You want them to be prepared. There's a very big difference. I think I don't even know, honestly. I think the first step that you need to do as a country is just see how other countries did it and analyze them and look like, how do you communicate these kinds of things? Because even like people study crisis and disaster communication for 4 years. Like that's a whole program in itself, let alone communicating that, for example, through to an entire community. But the least you can do is, for example, incorporate, you know, good governance practices. Just be transparent. Like your people are not dumb. So don't try to, you know, dumb it down for people in the back. Like everyone is hearing you.
Yeah.
We can see you. You know, so also treat us like we're adults that are sitting at this table, like we're a part of that grown-up conversation right now. And not only do we deserve to have a seat as a community that is at that table of when these discussions are held, it's our right to know. It's your right to have access to accurate, reliable information. And that is already, I don't think, fully established.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's another barrier. Like it's constantly like when you put it down in the back. And this was my thesis. I'm not even gonna lie. It was one thing that led to another, that directly led to another, that directly led to another. Some positive, some negative, a lot negative.
A lot negative.
But we need to start somewhere. We need to start somewhere. And I mean, I left on a note of where I gave my recommendations, which were basically strategies of overcoming vulnerabilities. So one of them was, for example, also like a lack of knowledge on the topic. We have the internet. Like this is a thing and you can access it and you can get any kind of thing that you need when you have the right sources. So why are you not making use? Because you say there's no resources. That's a lie.
We might not have the best internet, but we have internet.
but it sure as hell works, you know.
It might take a little longer to load, but the
And I
information
mean,
would load.
it definitely was when I went to college that I discovered the wonders of Google Scholar. But I mean, if you just give that information, not only give that to your community, but use it yourself. Like, take some time to understand what is going on, because it's your responsibility to be aware of new trends. It's your responsibility to, because that's the job that you applied for and you got when you're in these positions. And they're also, I think, one of the biggest issues, Cam, to be honest, that I also saw, in the sense that I was there not only in the organization, but I think throughout government, is that there is an immense lack of monitoring and control. We don't look back at how we did something and try to adapt and do it differently. We don't hold people that make mistakes accountable. We don't. There are no consequences for absences in responsibilities, you know? And so then how do we expect change? Because we understand there's change. There's a need for change. The people that are responsible for are just like, yeah, you know, like, I understand that I need to do this. Like, I'm aware we're going to try to do this. But what if they don't? Then nothing. Exactly. So then you're giving them that freedom, and that's a freedom that we cannot afford. And we repeat mistakes.
All the time.
There's so much negative effects that come from a lack of good governance and accountability and monitoring and control. And these are things that are generally easy to do once you just take a bit of time to create, for example, an evaluation template, or, you know, like, take times for proper debriefing. It's not hard. And that's what really just was extremely frustrating, is that it was brought across as if it was the most difficult, extreme, time-consuming actions and efforts that need to be executed in order to build climate resilience. And that's not the case. And I think that is just a convenient excuse, again, to say, you know, like, right now we can't do that because we're focusing on other things, which I understand. But you're going to need to tend to it at some point. Because
guess what? The main focus of other things that we're doing right now is the coho. And I'm certain there are some parts of the coho that talks about how we treat our environment and what we're doing next for natural disasters. And so, like I mentioned earlier, I am tired. Like, like, just excuses of excuses and excuses, and you're just like,
exactly.
What are we supposed to do if we're telling you all this information? We're giving you all this information. We're like, this is what we need to do next. This is how we need to improve next. And then you're not improving. And I know you mentioned good governance. Like I said, since of course, it's been an issue before then.
Yeah.
But let's just look in the concept of this new constitutional status we're in. We're a country. We function as a country. Yeah, you know, some things we gotta go to the Netherlands, sure, whatever, because we're not a sovereign state. Cool. So many things. It has you thinking, like, what was our preparation to this state? Because obviously we're not prepared. We were not prepared for this new constitutional status. Now we're in this new constitutional status, and you can see we're not prepared.
Yeah.
And then you talk about accountability. We made those mistakes. Cool. So then why are we not trying to right those wrongs that we did? Why not we're trying to make ourselves better and then prepare for these conversations? Again, we're talking about fully decolonizing, which is the final step of fully decolonizing, is independence and becoming a type of republic. We can barely function in this matter that we are. Why are we, for example, you're trying to drive from St. Peter's to Marigot. Why are you jumping over the hill with the road closed instead of going around Colby Hill?
Yeah. Like,
that's basically what we're doing. We're going up Marigot Hill, knowing Marigot Hill is closed, and you have to go through a bush track when you get all scratch up and bite up and everything. And by the time you reach to the bottom in Concordia, you mash up and you don't have any more resources to keep on moving. Instead of going in somebody I-20 and going around Kobe Hill and crossing the border to get to the port. It's like,
it's just, the math is not mathing.
It's not mathing. The math is not mathing at all. At all. And it's just, I guess at the end of the day, it's like, here are the resources.
Yeah.
Do what you have to do.
Do what you have to do. And I mean, at the end of the day, like I keep saying, like, I don't know the full gist behind it, but it just doesn't seem that hard to me to incorporate small things. And this, like, I mean, like the concept of community resilience is scientifically considered, you know, a completely different entity besides climate resilience. You can't go without the other. You can't be resilient without your community being on that same level.
Yeah.
And so those will have to go hand in hand. But you need to start with this. It has to start with the system, because how can you expect to execute efforts that contribute or build climate resilience if your system does not incorporate it in its decision making? It can't. It can't.
It really cannot.
For example, you know, like put a pizza in the oven and then expect a macaroni pie to come out when it's been cooking. Like, that just makes absolutely no sense, because you put a pizza in. Like, that's your focus. So obviously you're going to get a pizza. You know?
And not a macaroni pie. And no, I want macaroni pie.
That's not what you baked.
Yeah. And no, I want a macaroni pie. That's a lot of work. I don't sling. But no, but in reality, and I think this is how we can wrap up, because in reality, we focus and we say we're resilient people. And I will tell you how hard it was for me to go through this whole topic, because I hate the word resilience at this point. But it makes sense with the topic we're talking about. But since from the first press conference since after the hurricane till now, 5 years basically, we're always talking about how we are resilient people. Well, why are you not? And of course, this has to take personal accountability as well. But you can only do so much. But why are you not providing the resources? Why are you not providing the education? Why are you not providing the comfort, the understanding of pushing to make somebody resilient? And being a resilient person in this context, because like you said, resilience has so many different definitions. Yeah. Putting resilience on a specific person and not just on the nation is not a compliment people think it really is.
Exactly.
You're telling these people, I appreciate you, to dealing with confusion, with nonsense, with disaster, with all these things. You're not telling people that we're making things better. No, you're like, oh yeah, you just gotta keep on one more, like, you know, you gotta keep on going,
but at least we're not doing worse. We're resilient.
Yeah, like we're doing bad, but you're still alive, so you shouldn't really complain that much. No, because if everyone's purpose to live was to be in bad situations,
yeah,
I think that changes the whole narrative of what you're doing and living on this planet that is literally on fire, basically.
Yeah.
And so it's like, it goes to the question, I guess the open-ended question to everybody who's listening, whatever, are we resilient? Question mark.
I'm curious what people think.
I'm gonna say nah, but you know.
I mean, ditto.
I mean, and so I guess as we transferred. Am I going to school? Anyways, as we go from, I guess, a very detailed, very in-depth, serious conversation, which for those who don't understand, you know, we know each other since high school. This is conversations we have like all the time.
All the time.
And so we're just making, we're just letting you listen in on these conversations. But I guess, like you mentioned, I guess the best part of this internship was like you had the option of being home for a couple months and not being in, the Netherlands for a couple months.
That I don't think you understand how happy I was already to just leave the country, because the pandemic is not fun. Like, I'm so tired of it. But being home, I think, if I look at the question, what is the best part of being home? I got a taste of what it could be like to contribute. And that was sublime. I felt empowered. I felt heard. And I felt like people took me seriously, and that's more than I actually expected I would get. And it also confirmed that I want to come back. Like, even though it was a very interesting roller coaster experience, it only lit like a fire under my butt of, we're doing what we need to be doing. I get energy out of it. I still see my passion in it. So I think that confirmation was, like, to me, the best part of it.
That's good. I'm glad, like, despite, everybody running you around the country, you still had a good, like, an eye-opening experience to be like, this is something that I want to do. This is something that I want to change, which is good because,
like, you saw me going through it in our call. You saw me going through it. But I think that's also a part of the experience. I learned that not everyone will like me and not everyone will like what I have to say, but I'm still going to do what I'm here to do. So,
No, that makes sense. And so with that being said, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. It was fun. I hope people find it informative. I hope people think that we actually make sense. If you don't believe that we don't make sense, tell us so we could stop talking. Like, tell me if I don't make sense. Like, let me know.
But thank you so much for having me and allowing me to speak on your platform. I love what you do. So being a part of that is honestly amazing.
Thank you very much. And with that being said, that is episode 7 of season 2 of the We Talking podcast. And I'll see you next time. Bye.